was standing right there when she let go. I was begging you, please, but you still said no. I was washing my hair. You were washing your hands of the whole affair. What a drag, you let me down. Turn my back and you're not around. Once in a while, once in a while. Better to lose, you know it's hard to find. Better to lose, you know it's on my mind. But here I go again. I won't hold my breath while I wait on you. Here I go, about to let you down. Here I go again.
Nirvana exploded onto the world rock scene, seemingly from nowhere in the early 90s. With their unique combination of sound, looks and attitude, Nirvana's timing was just right for young audiences at the time. The music scene of the late 80s were dominated by manufactured pop acts who had sat on the charts for the previous decade. Here was a band who tore up the pop rulebook and introduced the world to the unique Seattle grunge sound, which the region had been secretly developing for many years. The grunge sound had been nurtured by Seattle punk bands such as Soundgarden, the Melvins and Mudhoney, and yet it was to be Nirvana who would introduce this sound to a waiting world, and in doing so, change music forever. Here is their story.
Once in a while, once in a while, once in a while.
The local Seattle rock scene was developing the first rumblings of a new global sound way before Nirvana appeared on the scene. What we know now as grunge was a product of Seattle's isolated northwestern location, far from outside music influences. Washington State, however, was big enough to support a local rock club circuit, and there were plenty of bands able to support themselves in this way. So why was it Nirvana that finally introduced the sound to an increasingly desperate waiting world?
I think Nirvana was successful because it was the best underground band ever. In musical terms, there is no punk band to match them. Cobain's songwriting is nonpareil. I think that by the time they made it, they were just good enough technically to pull it off. And I think that this extreme moral seriousness and at the same time the anarchic, goons-like silliness of the band appealed to children of all ages. You know, it fulfilled the original dream of rock and roll to keep us young forever.
Catchy songs, I mean, you can hum them. And you can play them on an acoustic guitar and sing them around the campfire. That's how strong the melodies are and how simple the songs are. I mean, that's something that is really overlooked in a lot of popular music nowadays, where people concentrate on the rhythm and the beat and the attitude, and they forget about the hook. And their songs were all hooks, all about the hooks, really.
A lot of that's Nirvana music. My wife collected them. Yeah, and every time a new one would come out, she'd buy it. And I never did like it until I saw Kurt, I think it was on MTV, where he was just sitting out there playing the guitar and singing. Then you didn't have all that noise from the drums and the other hollering and hooting and stuff. And I thought it was pretty good then.
I think it was the voice first, the lyrics second. The band was a good band, but the band did several different kinds of music. So I think the band was, You know, the band rocked and the band was competent, and it was, especially once Dave joined, the fact that Kurt was a ratty guitar player kind of made it even better, you know, where maybe Chad was a ratty drummer with a ratty guitar player and a ratty bass player, so once they had a big drummer to hang all the ratty shit off of, it made more sense.
People credit them for their innovation. Expression of emotion in his singing and in his voice that is, like, that's more unique than the music, I think.
Right, but Kurt, you know, wasn't necessarily a Jimi Hendrix. He would get clear up on the fretboard and play bizarre, distorted noises, you know, and mess around for a long time with noises like that, don't you think?
Oh, yeah.
And record it and then
His
distort it.
early tapes of just him playing guitar and singing that he'd make to a boombox were really horrible.
Yeah.
And I didn't, until he recorded that demo that became Incesticide with Indino, I thought, yeah, Kurt's band, you know, that'll be great.
And he definitely talked about creating a band even as early as being 12 years old. A lot of us talked about that at the time, and so it was just kind of, you know, conversation more. But, you know, you'd think he probably was more serious about it than a lot of people gave him credit for, even at that time.
On Novoselic's part, he is a very talented bass player. But he also, I think, intuitively drove these songs. He was kind of the glue that really held the band together. Dave Grohl is just simply a tremendous drummer. In my opinion, probably one of the greatest rock drummers, certainly of modern times. He hit the drums with such a power that you wondered that they weren't going to break. And I saw a number of shows where he did break the drums.
Kurt, he had the look, he had the lyrics. You know, they had the type of sound that I think people were waiting for, that Generation X, you know. They were waiting for something like this to arrive, and certainly it did, and it blasted.
There aren't any other bands, as far as I'm concerned, that come close to what they were and what they could have been, for me, individually.
It's true that Kurt Cobain was the soul of Nirvana in terms of his songwriting and his artistic vision. But I think that all three of these individuals played a huge part in the success and creation of this band. And without Novoselic and Grohl, this would not have been the same thing.
I'll move on to the next Nirvana now. No, I'm not bored, just uninspired.
Kurt Cobain was born in Aberdeen, Washington in 1967. Situated near the coast, Aberdeen lies a world away from the bright lights of the city, surrounded by rolling mountains, never-ending forests and continual rain. The whole town is dominated by the region's one and only major industry, logging. During Kurt's childhood, the logging industry suffered enormously, the impact from which permeates every aspect of the region. But Kurt grew up a happy kid who showed an artistic talent from an early age, as his grandfather remembers.
There's Kurt when he was a little guy. There's only a little bit bigger. Right from the start, he was, boy, he was a hell of an artist. One time he come over to the house when we lived in Aberdeen. Him and his folks come over to the house, and he had a picture, and he came up and he said, "Look at Grandpa, he had a picture of Mickey Mouse that he drew. He was 6 years old." And I said, "You didn't draw that." I said, "You traced that." He got sort of mad. He said, "Yes, I did too draw that." And he says, "I'll draw you another one." He said, "I'll draw you a Donald Duck." And he sat down then and on a piece of paper and drew me a Donald Duck. I got it in here yet.
In 1976, at the age of 9, Kurt's parents divorced. Kurt moved to the nearby town of Montesano with his father, transferring to Beacon Elementary School. Here he met one of his long-lasting school friends, Darren Nevery.
When I first met Kurt, it was, I want to say like 1975. We were in the 4th grade, and he was just a new kid that came in, and he was very shy, but he did have a very good sense of humor. And you know, he loved like Saturday Night Live and, you know, all the comedy and things like that. So he was, you know, quiet and reserved at times, you know, especially in his younger years. But, you know, the more you got to know him, you know, he was a lot of fun to be around.
I don't know, I remember him as a good kid, is the way I remember him. He always helped around here when he lived with us.
He definitely had highs and lows. A lot of times he was a very happy kid, but then there was a lot of times when his mood would be down in the dumps. You know, things would come up, you know, especially if it was around, you know, say something was focused around divorce, you know, like his parents or things like that. You know, he did have some times where, you know, certain things he was uncomfortable about, or just, you know, he'd have a hard time, be in a bad mood, like most kids, you know, but you know, he had a lot of happy times too.
Kurt's dad, when he was a little guy, he took steel guitar lessons, and we still had the guitar, and we'd give it to Kurt. But the amplifier didn't work right, and he finally, I guess, just tore it all up to see what it was made of. And he'd always pounding on pots and pans, beating them. We always thought he'd be a drummer instead of a guitar.
Because Kurt and I both were in school, especially at that age, were really small in stature. And to see him carrying that big snare drum in a case around was, you know, it was kind of funny. But then just to hear him play that and beat on it, you know, you knew right then that he, you know, he was musically talented. And as we got older, like the high school, when he was in band, you know, we'd maybe have another class like PE that was close to the band room, and you'd hear this drum playing. I mean, someone just beating the drums like you can't believe, you know. I mean, it sounded like a rock drummer, you know. So, you know, people would actually go to the band room, you know, they'd hear this and you just follow the sound, and, you know, here's Kurt on the drums, you know, just going for it like between classes or something. And, you know, right then I was like, wow, you know, I figured he'd grow up to be a drummer, you know.
Kurt's obvious affinity for the drums made his family and friends think he would become a famous drummer. But instead, his musical interest moved towards the guitar.
When I first saw Kurt play the guitar, we must have been like 15 at the time. You know, he may have played some before that, but, you know, probably kind of a closet player maybe as he was getting good, and you could tell that every time you saw him, he must have practiced an awful lot, you know, because he got better fairly quickly. You know, from going from that time period when he was just learning how to play the guitar and just growing up around this area, I don't think anybody ever envisioned how big he would become. It was very amazing to see him progress, and yeah, you don't know what kind of expectations to have for that person, you know, at the time. Even knowing they're so talented, it's, you know, especially when they get as big as Nirvana got, very, you know, I don't think anybody could have predicted that.
Krist Novoselic was born in California, but moved to Aberdeen after his parents too were divorced. At 6'7" and of Croatian descent, Krist was impossible to miss around Aberdeen. He started his lifelong friendship with Kurt after being introduced by a friend, Jesse Reed. Jesse, Kurt and Krist all played the guitar together, running through the usual Kiss and Led Zeppelin covers. Nothing emerged from these initial sessions except a close and loyal friendship. Little did they know what the future would hold for them. moving back from Montesano High School to his new school, Weatherwax in Aberdeen, Kurt hooked up with classmates Steve and Paul, who shared his love of heavy metal.
I looked over and there was this other kid that I recognized, little blonde guy, sitting next to me. And I could tell he wasn't in the 12th grade. And he had Motorhead written on his peachy with all the other bands of the day, Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and such. And I said, "Hey, you like Motorhead?" And he opened his peachy and he had all these cutout pictures of different bands, guitar players. He had a picture of Lemmy Kilminster from Motorhead flipping off a Ronald McDonald statue. And I said, "Hey, that's awesome." And from then on, we hung out quite a bit. And he eventually began living at my house. And he lived with me for about 8 months. He'd go see his mom quite often. She always knew where he was. He just didn't want to live by their rules.
There were virtually no opportunities for Kurt economically in Aberdeen. I mean, he considered joining the military because that was one of the only job prospects. He worked for a while washing dishes at a, resort-type restaurant that was even down on its luck, and he took a job at the YMCA teaching kids how to swim. But none of these were jobs that paid more than minimum wage. And I was able to get a copy of Kurt's resume in the context of doing my book, and it was hilarious because he listed his employment, and it was pitiful.
The young Kurt and his friends steered well away from heavy-duty drugs, but like most of their peers, smoked pot and sniffed gas.
There was a time when, like in 9th grade, we were, pretty disrespectful at times, just being normal teenagers. And one time, he had asked me if I wanted to go outside of the school and smoke some pot with him. And, at the time I thought, yeah, why not, so let's go. And I thought we'd go hide somewhere to do it. Well, I follow him right out to the very front of the school and behind like a big rhododendron bush. I mean, it was probably about the stupidest thing you could do. But of course we do it, and he gets away with it, and of course he thinks it's great. And it was it was ballsy to do it, and it was also just kind of like, he was showing that, he would do things like that, and how, anti-authority he was.
We were really, 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 really heavy drinkers and heavy substance abusers at really young ages, and Kurt was too. He made this big apparatus to huff isobutane out of the bottom of Ed's shaving grid gel, and he declared himself addicted to Ed's shaving gel at one point.
At the age of 16, and not being able to settle at either of his parents' or friends' homes, Kurt got his own house, a move he was immensely proud of.
It was a horrible little house, but he was really proud of it. I remember that he was really hurt because he showed it to his mom, who didn't live that far away at the time. And she said that she didn't like the idea of her son living in a rundown shack. And it really hurt his feelings because he was really proud. This was his house, He was very possessive of it. My house, it's not a crummy apartment, it's a house. And it was like a little 2-bedroom thing that he lived with Luke in.
He applied for a job cleaning dog kennels, essentially washing down dog feces, and he was deemed not qualified for that job. So you really have to say, if you're not qualified to clean up dog crap, what are you qualified for? He worked as a janitor briefly. He eventually was fired from that job. He was not a very diligent, hard worker for the most part, but there was very little opportunity for him in any context.
Kurt would buy pounds of potatoes, and he had this scummy old dress shirt that he would use to soak the grease out of them, and they'd live on French fries. And one day we were there, and we were high on acid, and Kurt decided he was going to make a lava lamp. He said he knew how.
I remember that.
He put this old candle wax, he melted it into the French fry oil and put it in this fucking mason jar and put it under a light bulb, and was trying to get it to work like a lava lamp. And then we all got mad and he threw it on some girl from the neighborhood. At one point he was going to pretend he was mentally retarded so he could get a free high school diploma and go to the retarded class.
Yeah, I remember.
And he was sure that would be an easy way to get through high school and not have to do anything but grunt and moan. And it never came to fruition.
Yeah.
After a succession of dead-end jobs, it became obvious that there were few opportunities around that fitted in with Kurt and his lifestyle. There was, however, a local Aberdeen-based band, the Melvins, who inspired Kurt and his friends enormously.
The Melvins' influence was huge. Buzz Osborne, not for just Kurt, but for anybody that wanted anything to do with music in a sort of punk rock underground sort of level, not just in Grays Harbor, but in Seattle as well. Buzz Osborne's been a sort of a daunting shadow to live under, and it probably affected nobody more than Kurt Cobain.
I remember the first time the Melvins went on a national tour. We were bored as hell. We didn't have anyone to hang around with. There was no, because it was like a ritual to go to band practice. Kurt and me and a few other people were allowed to actually sit in the room with them and totally deafen ourselves listening to the Melvins. And one afternoon, Pig and Kurt and I were taking acid. And Kurt said, well, we should just go and bullshit our way into Krober's house and we'll jam. And Pig played a little guitar. At the time, I didn't play anything. And Kurt walked to the front door and pounded on the door, and Dale's dad came out, and he was known to have a few, and he was really drunk. And Kurt said, we're the band, we got to jam. And he just moved out of the way and led us back into the back room.
He was an old dude.
We went back there, and I played drums, and Kurt played guitar, and Pig screamed obscenities.
Yeah.
And we taped them all over Krober's Jimi Hendrix tapes. We filled them full of this horrible, horrendous noise. And I remember Krober got back from tour, and he was like really pissed at us. Who did that?
I mean, Kurt wanted really nothing more than to be a member of the Melvins when he was growing up, and he was never offered that job, so he ended up creating his own band that was, more Melvin-esque maybe than the Melvins themselves.
He tried out for the Melvins and totally lost it and couldn't do anything, and
choked.
Yeah.
But he got together with Novi, and Novi in high school, God, was just a one-man entertainment
yeah,
show.
No Such was the class clown that was older.
He was real
He
tall.
ran for student body vice president at one point, and I remember my sister saying, stay away from that guy, he ate rhododendrons.
Well, Kurt had met Krist Novoselic in high school, and so they met when Kurt was about 15 or so. Krist was 1 year older. They really didn't become friends until Kurt had dropped out of high school. Novoselic had graduated. He always sort of jokingly said later that he managed a lot of the band's finances because he was the only one with a high school education, which is true. So they became fast friends, probably in about 1986 or so. Their friendship really began to blossom. The band began in about 87, 88. It's still hard to know when the genesis of it actually is.
Novoselic was Kurt's oldest friend, and his bass playing, while it's not, he's not a virtuoso on the bass, but he is very musical in a way that reminded me, an old fart from the Boomer era, of Paul McCartney.
Well, at first they jam above
Cobain's
Chris's mom's hair salon.
Yeah.
And it would just be party time. And Kurt would play the drums sometimes, and they'd play a half-assed version of Hey, Hey, We're the Monkees with Chris on guitar and Kurt playing drums. And then they were trying to find a drummer.
Novoselic, brought in a number of the other players of the band. Kurt also knew Chad Channing, the original drummer. Aaron Burkhart was a neighbor. So people were sort of in and out of the band at that point.
For a while, Greg Hokanson played bass, and they were called Fecal Matter with Krober on the drums. And then they went to Seattle to Kurt's aunt's house to record a 4-track demo. And they decided that Hokanson was a misogynistic, racist, redneck hick, and so Kurt played the bass too on that. And that tape's still, there's a copy of it somewhere.
1987, a friend of the band, Ryan Agner, was instrumental in helping the band towards their first steps towards stardom. The band used to practice and eat at Ryan's house, and unlike the rest of the band, he held down a stable job.
And I would come by Chris and Shelley's house on my way home from work, and one day Chris says, hey, Kurt and I have got this band together. So we went to this little house over on the east side of Aberdeen. So anyway, we wandered on in, and it was pretty scary, borrowed equipment and all sort of set up in this living room, and we started playing. And it was good from the beginning. Kurt rarely worked and had little money, and so before too long we got to be friends and whatnot. And I worked, and I was comfortable, and I would cook and eat well, and so I'd invite him over for dinner, and of course then we'd talk more about music. Kurt felt that that there wasn't a lot of new territory to be discovered with music, particularly for himself, because he had made probably what he considered to be a relatively thorough study of music for our age. He was more interested in the melody, in the way its counterpoint with the rest of the song, how it worked, the grand scheme, the total package. That's what he was delivering. Did it rock? Did it get you the hook?
More oxygen, more oxygen, more oxygen.
The band carried on developing their underground punk style and, for the first time, seriously considered playing to an audience. In 1987, Ryan got the band their first gig by suggesting they play at a small party thrown by his friends Tony Pecula and Jeff Forrest. The now legendary performance took place in the front room of Tony and Jeff's house in the nearby small town of Raymond.
And I ran into Tony one day, and I said, you know, there's these dudes that I discovered, this band, and they're cool, man. They got this stuff going on, and you guys jam once in a while down here, don't you? You know, Friday night party, you know, strike up the band, that kind of thing. He's like, yeah, we do that. And I said, well, I ought to get these guys to come down, because the way it played in my head was, you know, these guys rock.
Turn the lights out when you try to hide. When your brain begins to wander, drop the gun and shallow.
It was, to all intents and purposes, the first Nirvana show. They played to a crowd of a dozen mullet-headed, metal-loving teenagers. The trio performed a chaotic set, including Downer, Spank Through and Aero Zeppelin. Tony and his friends were all there on that infamous night.
I remember sitting in there and thinking, wow, this is really different than anything that we've been listening to, and I liked it, but then you would hear comments from other people, you know, because they wanted, you know, the heavy metal hair bands.
They wanted us up there
and
playing.
Nirvana was different, and they didn't appreciate the difference, but there was a lot of people that did.
Yeah.
Chris was really into his guitar. He wanted the feedback, and he'd kind of lay his guitar down, and we would all just
I mean, that was a
be
big
plugging
thing.
our ears.
What the different thing was all that feedback.
Their performance didn't benefit from acoustics. I mean, it was.
The thing that struck me was Chris's bass playing. I mean, I picked that up first. I mean, he was just a phenomenal bass player. I just thought, wow, he was really good. And I mean, as far as talent goes, I could see those guys going somewhere. But at the time, it's like I said, you know, we all thought that, you know, it's just another band coming to play.
Kurt's voice kind of struck me as unusual too. I remember thinking about his voice, and it wasn't melodious. It was just it was good, and it was different from anything that I've heard before, and I was appreciating that also.
If you run the reel forward and look at the sort of classic Nirvana performance, it was all there. Everything. Same thing he did that night was same show he put on 4 or 5 years later. But he terrorized the sound waves that night.
totally antisocial. I don't remember him speaking the whole night, looking up, making eye contact with anybody.
Even most of the pictures you see, hair covering his face.
Krist was a different story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was much more social.
Absolutely.
He was into more of the shock.
Yeah.
Trying to shock everyone. He had vampire blood and he was putting it on him and
duct tape over his
duct
nipples.
tape. Yeah. That's right, I remember that now. Yeah. They were jumping on the furniture, standing on the coffee table, jumping on the couch.
laying the guitar down and having the feedback. And
they didn't start off like that. It kind of started out a little bit mellow, and I think the more they got into the beer, the more that they got rambunctious, and that's when they started getting really...
The style came out.
And after a while, the sort of music side of the night petered out, and I started kind of making sure where everybody was and that things were okay, and that's when I noticed that things were not okay. The two camps had gotten into this sort of harassment mode where, you know, Krist was belligerent and doing things, and Kurt was trying to upset people with his verbal abuse and whatnot. And
they didn't have a lot of respect for anyone's property.
No.
Not that it was anything special, but
not
what we
that
had is
anybody
what
who
we
came
had.
here really had respect for the property.
No.
Aaron came up to me and said, "It's time to go." Okay, I think you're right.
The atmosphere that night had got to the point that it was time for them to go. And I just remember them all jumping in the back of this van or carpet truck or whatever it was. There was no lights in the back of it. It was like a... No windows, no windows. It was like a rented U-Haul truck or something. And I just remember them all jumping in the back of that thing and slamming the door down, and off they went. And I think we all just kind of came in to survey the damage by that point.
In the grand scheme of things, for many years, it was not one of my greater moments, you know. The beginning of Nirvana was a shaky ordeal for everybody involved.
At a local level, the band's determination paid off, slowly developing a loyal fan base in Aberdeen and the surrounding area. But life was still hard for Kurt, taking on many poorly paid jobs to support his music and living rough for many months to come.
The Community World Theatre on 56th Street and M in Tacoma, Washington, Jim May's operation there, and it fulfilled a relatively vital need for the growth of Nirvana as a performance band and for our audience.
Well, the first time that I really went to see his band was right after they recorded the Andino demo with Krover. They played a show in Tacoma at the Community World Theatre or whatever. It was a little teeny dumpy place that probably used to be a porn theater. And they played with this straight-edge hardcore band. And they were really good.
There was a lot of local talent at that time that was really phenomenal. And I think people need to understand that Nirvana were one of a dozen bands that really were bands that were on the rise in '88 and '89.
And then these were important gigs. I remember Kurt actually worrying about, you know, his wardrobe. What was he going to wear? He kind of wanted to wear these funky disco shoes. He thought it'd be funny or something, you know. And would pine over the set it up just so. And you know, this was a big deal. This was to go up there and play in front of people was it. There was, you know, there was nothing, no consideration to what would ultimately happen. And it was painful, you know, because a lot of times nobody'd show up, I mean, just being in the place was painful. They wouldn't have the heat on or anything, and you know, it was pretty primitive in there. That was the proving ground for Nirvana.
Their live shows were really hit or miss, and I think that it's really hard when a band has become so successful and so powerful. All the stories become apocryphal. The story all becomes, they were fantastic the first time I saw them. I knew they were genius. And anybody that tells that story is probably making it up, because there were very few people in the Seattle music scene that thought they were great live. I've always thought they were better on record. Their live shows, at least early on. Later on, they became a better live band than they were on record, I think.
The natural progression for any band wanting to break out of Aberdeen at the time was to base themselves in the nearby town of Olympia. Kurt had visited Olympia during 1987 while acting as an unpaid roadie for the Melvins. At the time, it was a hip college town with a reputation for being a hotbed of artists, freaks and underground musicians. Kurt was keen to move in straight away. It was another friend of the band, Slim Moon, who recognised their combined talent and arranged for their first gig in Olympia, becoming an ardent follower of the band.
I've seen a lot of great Nirvana shows, and the one that stands out for me was a show on Halloween one year. They just really went all out and just smashed the crap out of their guitars, and just really, it just felt so explosive. After they had played such a great, just really awesome, powerful music, and then they just like went crazy at the end.
It was also about the time that Nirvana played at Chaos. That's the little college radio there at Evergreen State College in Olympia. That show was important because a lot of bootlegs were made. It was virtually the first recorded Nirvana ever made, other than the recording that I have of the Raymond show. That recording made the rounds and set the stage for what would later be the buzz.
The band continued to play at parties and small venues in the Olympia area. During this time, however, their drummer, Aaron Burkhart, dropped out, leaving Kurt and Krist with the thankless task of finding a replacement. But the duo managed to persuade Dale Crover from the Melvins to fill in temporarily, and in January 1988 drove up to Reciprocal Studios in Seattle to record their first demo tracks. The big break had come after a phone call from Kurt to local rock legend producer Jack Endino. Having been impressed by the chemistry formed by Kurt, Krist and the already well-respected Melvins drummer, Endino agreed to record the band for a minuscule fee. This resulted in the first tracks being recorded for the future Nirvana album Bleach.
I just got a phone call from a guy named Kurt from Aberdeen who said he was a friend of the Melvins and he wanted to come up and record, and he would have Dale from the Melvins playing drums with him. And since I held Dale's drumming in very high regard, I said, yeah, come on up, let's do it. How much money do you want to spend? How much time do you want to book? And he said, well, we've only got, a few $100s. We just have time for one afternoon, and we're just going to record some songs and just mix them right on the spot as fast as we can. And, you make a tape, get some shows with it or whatever. And he said, well, we don't really have a name yet. We're still looking for a permanent drummer. I said, well, whatever, come on up. So, and that led to the first Nirvana studio session, which was January 23rd of 1988. Chris and Kurt had this sort of chemistry going where they just complemented each other very well. It just seemed like a very strong, if young, band. And something about Kurt's voice really appealed to me. I thought he had a very good rock scream, kind of a raw, throaty sort of. It was a very enjoyable session. I just liked it. I thought it was good. I thought they had some good riffs. you know, some good rock songs. Kurt would come up with the song, and Krist would come up with the bass line that would sort of get that sound, that very distinct, big, simple, to the point, no beating around the bush bass line that he would come up with.
Things will be alright. Things will be okay. Every single night.
Well, I think that Bleach, for the most part, is very much an album about Kurt's circumstances at the time. You know, he's writing a lot of songs on that record that he'd been working on for several years, so they're kind of his early sketchings. In my opinion, there are a lot of songs on that record that aren't as successful lyrically, because I think Kurt was so indebted to some of these lyrics that he'd crafted that he didn't feel like changing them a lot, you know.
About a Girl was kind of the odd song, because it's sort of the melodic pop tune, if you will, and it sort of stuck out. And Kurt said, you know, I don't know if people will be ready for this song, but I really want to do one pop song on this record. So, and I said, hey, you know, I'm just the engineer here, you know, whatever, I'll make it sound good, you go ahead.
Yeah, and for me, About a Girl, which is such a simple song, it's essentially about his girlfriend at the time. And he said, according to some of the friends that I interviewed of his, that he had listened to the Beatles all day prior to writing that song. And I think it very much sounds like a Beatles song in terms of melody to me. But the idea that he could write such a simple song, you know, I Can See You Anytime for Free, you know, I mean, it's a beautiful melody idea. I think with that song, that was somewhat of a breakthrough for Kurt, because it was simplicity. Prior to that, I think he was trying to write almost too complicated punk and rock songs.
They were able to afford one reel of half-inch tape, which was 8-track tape. It was about 33 minutes worth. And they basically just filled up the tape with songs, which wound up being about 9.5 songs. And then once the tape had run out, they said, okay, that's it. Let's do the vocals now. So then they went back over the tape, and he sang all the vocals in one take. And then we mixed it. And I said, well, do you mind if I give your tape to some people? Because I thought it was really good. And I thought some friends of mine would really enjoy hearing this. So, you know, they said, oh, fine, because we're just going to give cassettes out to people, too. We need to, you know, we want people to know about us. So I gave some tapes to people, and one of them got to John Poneman at Sub Pop. There's a reason why it doesn't say produced by Jack and Dino on the record. Because really, I just engineered it. I mean, it was sort of produced by everybody, or perhaps produced by nobody. You know, it's really almost a live document of what they were doing at the time.
I think Dino was very important to creating that sound, and partially because of the fact that he just got out of the way. You know, he didn't try to stamp his individual artistic vision on it.
You know, most of that tape we did actually wound up on the Incesticide record in its original form. I never had a chance to remix it. Of course, it says produced by Jack and Dino on it, so, you know, what it doesn't say is produced in about 3 hours. But whatever, it sounds okay, I suppose.
Nirvana have always had a potted history with drummers, with Kurt and Krist always striving for sonic perfection and often venting their fury at any performer not giving 100%. This was exacerbated by Kurt's own experience playing the drums for so long. Dale Crover soon had to return to the Melvins, but recommended a local Aberdeen drummer, Dave Foster, as a replacement. After a problematic start, however, Kurt decided Dave was not up to the job and fired him, leaving the band once again drummerless. Meanwhile, Jack Endino had started passing the band's demo tapes around influential movers of the Seattle rock scene. Jonathan Poneman of Seattle indie label Sub Pop was impressed enough to add Nirvana to the bill of their next Sub Pop Sunday showcase concert at Seattle's tiny Vogue Club. In June 1988, Kurt and Krist returned to Reciprocal Studios with new drummer Chad Channing to cut their debut single, Love Buzz.
Chad Channing, who was the drummer that was the longest drummer other than Dave Grohl, was this little tiny short guy, you know. I mean, I had some people describe him almost as an elf when I was working on my book. And so the combination of him and Kurt, both these really short guys with really long hair, it was a freak show. It was a circus seeing this band. You had two really short guys with long hair, and you had this gigantic, you know, ogre of a guy almost that was taller than you could imagine. So they had quite a visual element, and the sound that they created was not really what you expected they would create from their looks.
However, they still didn't have a contract, any money, or indeed a fan base beyond a few kids in Olympia who were gradually catching on to this increasingly intense young band. They could tell something big was definitely stirring. Like most people, producer Steve Fisk's first impressions were not that great.
Yeah, the first time I saw them, I walked out on them. I thought they were terrible. But yeah, they were trying to work the extra guitar player into the band and having a bad evening, and I was so up to here with all my friends screaming trees and what I was saying, you've got to see this band. They're playing, and they played in Ellensburg, the small town I was saying. They played at the community center, and they just had a bad night. They weren't jerks, they just really sucked, and the PA was terrible and was hurting my ears, and I said, you know, I think I'm 33 years old and I'm going to go work on my own music right now instead of watch these guys suffer through a bad set, you know, just to say I saw Nirvana.
But Steve soon realised he'd seen the band on a bad day and was recommended to check them out again by enthusiastic fans and Jonathan Poneman from Sub Pop.
And Jonathan at Sub Pop thought it would be nice for me to work with Nirvana, you know, sort of after they did their Bleach record. Been a Son was probably where most of the work went, and they were working on harmonies and trying to kind of maybe make that into kind of like a bigger sound, you know. We had a digital reverb that was sort of the trendy thing for the time period, so I was showing them how to make the snare drum do the big kind of Born in the USA thing or something.
Well, I think when Kurt began to write about himself and his family, another song from that era, which Steve Fisk produced, was Been a Son, you know, a song, I think, about his sister who in her gender struggles for identity. When he began to turn to his own turf, I think he really became a more powerful songwriter.
Competition was really tough, with a lot of young bands fighting for supremacy. In those challenging early days, Nirvana performed better in the studio than live.
On the scene, their reputation at first was not distinguished in performance. They were not good performers until a couple of years after, at least a couple of years after they began. Then they got good towards the end, but they were not distinguished performers. Their first performance at the Vogue, for instance, which was attended by a very few distinguished Seattle scenesters, was not auspicious. It was on record that they were impressive, and particularly Cobain's songwriting gift was absolutely distinctive. It was astounding. I had listened to a number of records cut in Seattle, and nobody could match him. It was a one-man phenomenon, really, at the start. The Seattle scene was Kurt Cobain.
After only 30 hours in the studio, Nirvana had finally managed to record enough material to release their first album. Taken from the Bleach Your Works AIDS prevention poster, Bleach was released by Sub Pop in June '89, with little ceremony and zero marketing spend. Nirvana found themselves on a series of ill-promoted West Coast tours, with other Sub Pop stablemates Mudhoney and Tad, playing to tiny crowds, sleeping on cold floors, and virtually begging for food.
Kurt didn't like the fact that Sub Pop, at the time, Mudhoney was Sub Pop's main project. That was who they hyped to the ends of the earth. And he didn't like that. I mean, it's weird to even say it now because Mudhoney, a lot of people don't even know who Mudhoney is. But at the time, Mudhoney, I remember Kurt was the opening act on the Lame Fest at the Moore Theater, and Tad and Mudhoney were up above him. He didn't like that.
Unsurprisingly, the album bombed. But salvation came from an unexpected corner. Sub Pop paid for a few British music journalists to fly over and witness the tour. Excited by what they had discovered, a new musical next big thing buzz appeared in the UK music press, ceremoniously labelled the Seattle grunge scene.
They flew over, who was that guy from Melody Maker from England? Everett True, I think his name was, or something like that. He did a lot of hype in England. So in Britain, all these Sub Pop bands were supposedly huge, Mudhoney and Nirvana and things like that. And so it kind of, word of mouth kind of spread back to here, and it made them bigger and bigger. And then they were actually talking about, yeah, Kurt's going to sign with Geffen.
In truth, Nirvana were always a lot more pop than their sub-pop hard punk colleagues, but were happy for any exposure, and Julie went along with all the hype.
In some ways, Nirvana was actually one of the most unlikely bands to make it big, partially because they came from Aberdeen, they weren't as tied into the Seattle music scene, and partially because by the music that they did, it was a little bit different than some of the other bands. They weren't quite as punk always. They had more pop elements. But of course, that's what made them go huge, because once you mix that pop element in and you can get ballads that can be on the radio, like Come As You Are, you suddenly have an album that's really a juggernaut.
Nirvana continued to tour throughout 1990, which saw the departure of drummer Chad Channing. As the band was developing its powerful sound, Kurt became dissatisfied with Chad's style and commitment. They wanted a far more powerful drum approach. Buzz Osborne of the Melvins introduced Krist and Kurt to a 21-year-old drummer from Virginia, Dave Grohl. From his first audition, Grohl fitted in immediately, hitting the drums with such ferocity that he would virtually break drum skins whenever he played. This was more like it. The jigsaw and the final Nirvana lineup was now in place, and history was about to be made.
They were never really great until Dave Grohl joined the band, because he was an incredibly strong drummer, very loud, and he could sing harmony beautifully. He was a songwriter in his own right. And the other thing to remember is that Kurt Cobain was a very delicate person. His mental health was always on the edge, and he was kept creative by the efforts of his much more rooted friends who solved the everyday problems that would have overwhelmed him. I mean, washing his socks was something he couldn't handle. And when he was rooming with Dave Grohl, Grohl handled it because, as one of his friends said, Dave was raised in a van by wolves. And so he could cope with life on the road and life in a band in a way that Cobain could not.
I think by the time Dave Grohl joined the band in '90, the dynamics within the band began to shift a bit. Cobain became much more of a front man. People wanted him to be the front man. Interviewers weren't as interested in talking to the other band members. It became more the Kurt show, and I think it had run more as a democracy prior to that. Part of that was just with success. With success, people demanded much more out of Kurt.
When Dave Grohl joined the band, things worked more smoothly, partly because Kurt didn't have to anymore throw himself in rage against the drum kit because he was no longer so dissatisfied with what the drum kit was putting out. In concert, he famously used to interrupt the show by smashing his guitar and then smashing up the drum set. And it was because he was so angry at the fact that the song that he had in his head was being ruined by a drummer that wasn't up to snuff as he saw it. When Dave Grohl joined the band, the drummer most certainly was up to snuff.
These were exciting times for Nirvana, and Dave Grohl found himself touring England with the band literally weeks after joining them.
My sense is that many people perceive both Novoselic and Grohl as fun-loving, goofy guys, because generally if there was an interview going on with Kurt, you would have one of them putting fingers behind his head or dancing around the background, or that just sort of was the personality of the band that's been captured on video, and certainly that was the way they were in concert. Very fun going, let's just not take anything seriously. But both of those players are very intelligent people and quite bright.
I like to describe Dave as Art Garfunkel with balls. Imagine. Seriously, he was the final element musically in what made the band great, and he was another stabilizing influence, I think, in the psychology of the band and the fact that it can continue playing. And you can see that right up until the great MTV concert, when at one point Cobain is insecure about whether he can handle one of the songs and whether he should play the song solo and it was Dave Grohl who said, go for it. So I think that it was that human interplay that helped make the band great musically.
Grohl was only with the band for their last, few years. Novoselic and Cobain really had about a 10-year relationship, which, was much deeper probably than anybody else Kurt had ever dealt with in his life. He probably was as close to Krist as he was to anybody.
In 1990, Kurt met Courtney Love for the first time at a concert in Portland where the band were performing. The two were immediately attracted to each other, starting a tempestuous relationship that lasted for the next 2 years. This finally led to marriage on a Hawaiian beach in February 1992. 6 months later, Courtney gave birth to their daughter, Frances Bean. Kurt and Courtney's relationship was constantly tested to the limit, with Courtney often having to deal with the consequences of Kurt's drug addiction, depression, suicide attempts and periods in drug rehab. By 1991, a huge buzz had built up around the band, and after a massive record company bidding war, Nirvana signed with Geffen Records. With this, for the first time, came money, a new experience for the band. And for Kurt particularly, this meant access to any drugs he desired. Nirvana were ensconced in Sound City Studios in LA to record what would become one of the most important albums ever made. There are only a handful of albums over the last 50 years that have really changed music. Nevermind was to become one of them.
Even by major label standards, it was done fairly quickly. And even on Nevermind, from what I understand, Kurt probably didn't do more than 1 or 2 takes on any of the vocals. What I think it came down to, I think Butch Vig was a little more meticulous about drum sounds, about layering, about, he had a chance to see the band rehearse beforehand. He had demos. They basically spent more time on it and were more meticulous about the technical aspects of it. I think performance-wise, the band probably didn't do anything terribly different in the studio from how they did Bleach. It's just they were a better band at that point, and they didn't have to do a whole album in 3 days. They had a couple of weeks. And again, it's the fact that the songwriting was strong that makes it work like that. It didn't need a lot of extra bullshit added to it. So again, Butch just captured what they were about at the time, and same way Albini did later for the third record. They literally recorded it live, and he did the vocals over, and it was almost the same way we recorded Bleach. Just, Albini's aesthetic is a little different from mine, but he essentially did the same kind of job that I was trying to do on Bleach, which was just, okay, this is, the band wants me to just capture what they're doing because they're so good at what they're doing, they don't need a lot of production. That's the funny thing about Nirvana. They were very good at what they were doing. Nobody really could produce them.
The timing of Nevermind's release could not have been better. The first single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, and its accompanying video were virtually on continual loop at MTV and radio stations across the world. The album was a critical and commercial smash, breaking records around the world and propelling Nirvana to the top of both the rock and pop worlds.
By January of '92, his record was #1, and he was a huge star. So things changed almost overnight, but I don't think anyone could have predicted the level of success they had. And in some ways, I don't think they even wanted that much success. They wanted to be the biggest band in the world, but they really didn't want the pressures, the demands that came with that. And so I think it surprised everybody. It surprised Kurt as much as anybody else.
There's this danger of revisionist talk where people claim that they always knew. But if you go back to like the Rolling Stone review that when Rolling Stone reviewed Nevermind the first time, they called it basically a mediocre record, you read Rolling Stone now, and they basically pretend that they always knew that Nirvana was the most brilliant thing on the planet, you know. After, you know, that Nirvana left on tour to support Nevermind in 1991 with plans. You know, Kurt talked about, like, I'm going to take, after this tour, support this record, I'm going to take the money that I got and build a studio in Olympia. And he, you know, even had a building that he wanted to rent. And then they just kept extending the tour and extending the tour, and they basically never came back. Kurt's, as a matter of fact, his landlord evicted him for not coming back. You know, he didn't pay his rent, he didn't move his stuff out, and as I understand it, his landlord just threw his stuff out onto the street.
Having relentlessly toured and promoted Nevermind, in February 1993, the band hit the studio again, this time to record tracks for their third album, In Utero. For the first time, Nirvana were afforded the luxury of having as much time as they needed in the studio. Helmed by Steve Albini, the sessions saw an altogether more thoughtful and experimental sound emerging.
I think in some ways that the last album he made, In Utero, is the most sophisticated in terms of the sound, in terms of the recording, and in terms of the lyrics. And the video for Heart-Shaped Box, I think, could be considered his masterpiece. I think Krist Novoselic called it his last will and testament. And it's an amazingly sophisticated and interesting piece of art.
Personally, I think In Utero is their best record artistically. And then, you know, again, that record is almost start to finish about Kurt. It's autobiographical, you know. Teenage angst has paid off well. He begins, you know, talking about it. I mean, this is his life. It's not anyone else's. It's
too complicated to discuss, I suppose, but it is in some ways a portrait of his marriage. Originally, the song Heart-Shaped Box was called Heart-Shaped Coffin. I think Courtney probably convinced him that that was a bit too downbeat for a description of a marriage, and their marriage wasn't entirely downbeat. He changed it to Heart-Shaped Box to celebrate the famous heart-shaped box that she gave him as a symbol of their love. But it also expressed much more than that. It was a picture of his soul in the universe, and it was a portrait of the artist as a martyr, and it was it's a beautiful rock and roll song. I would say that's the summation of his work, but all the albums are worth listening to, and I think they'll all last.
As a songwriter, he found his groove when he began to write his own story. And, you know, the shame is, of course, that we didn't get to see that story turn into maturity, because I think there were a lot of great songs that he still had left in him.
In January 1994, following the inevitable commercial success of In Utero, Nirvana started a recording session at Robert Lang Studios in Seattle. The band recorded several songs, including the now infamous You Know You're Right.
The one that's been in the courts between Courtney and Dave and Chris and the attorneys, You Know You're Right, it was that song that we did here. And like I say, it's just that song particularly really is a wonderful recording, and it went on really well here. They were so stoked, the band, from the tracks on that and some other tracks that they did, but that particular track got more attention. Of course, Kurt's vocals were finished on that song.
Tragically, this was to be Kurt's last time in a recording studio. On the 8th of April 1994, he was found dead at his home in Seattle, a gunshot wound to his head and a gun by his side. Most of the material recorded at Robert Lang Studios was subsequently withheld, but in 2002, after many long legal wrangles, a song from that session was finally released, with many fans ecstatic to hear Kurt's voice again.
I was one of the very first people to hear You Know You're Right, other than the band members. You know, I heard it a couple years into working on my book, And I mean, obviously that song was released last year and everybody got a chance to hear it, but I assume that most people are going to have the same response when I heard it. When I heard it, what really surprised me is that it was like I never thought I'd hear that voice again, especially singing such a powerful, emotionally Latin song. And I was almost in tears hearing it because I was just shocked that there was another great Nirvana song that hadn't been released. There was something about the way he sang that really moves me. I think that Kurt was able to put a lot of emotion in everything he did.
The impact of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana on an unsuspecting world is still being felt, as their musical influence, even to this day, continues to play a big part in contemporary rock and pop. There are very few bands who simply change the face of music overnight. So what will be their legacy, and how should they be remembered?
I think Nirvana should be remembered not for Cobain's death, but for the life of their music, for the inspiration of his melodic gift, for the extreme seriousness of his artistic enterprise, for the sense of play that he infused it with. He was not by any means the most promising musician when things started out in the late 80s, but he became the greatest, and I think he will so remain.
In some ways, I do look at his life and I see some level of heroism for the fact that he was able to take that pain of his childhood and his growing up and create art out of it. Most people that have that kind of inner pain sit in their lazy boy recliner, eat Doritos, watch television, they don't do anything. Kurt took that pain and gave us a gift. He gave us art with it. And to me, that is in some ways even a way to admire him. Very few people are able to make those choices and be that courageous with their pain. And so, you know, for that reason alone, I admire his ability to take those kind of artistic risks.
Yeah, it was an amazing feeling. I was proud of him. I was happy for him, and you know, it's just fun to see someone that you're friends with be successful.
They've been pegged as this band that changed the 80s to the 90s pretty much. You know, they knocked down all those barriers, and you could just wear jeans and t-shirts and play guitars, and they weren't all the glam rock stuff that they supposedly just pretty much took the bottom out of. I think they'll always be remembered like that. I used to think that it was going to end and people were going to stop. They were going to be forgotten like Kajagoogoo or Duran Duran, but now I'm pretty sure that they've got their place in history.
Nirvana was a band that connected with people, the sensibilities. I mean, that whole Beatles sort of get in there and hook 'em thing. Kurt was into that, and he knew how to do it like a master. And none of the other bands had that going for them at that time.
They just happened to hit it right, hit the right tune, just like Glenn Miller when he was getting his band ready.
What sold Nirvana was Nirvana. You just had to hear them. That's all you had to do.